A clock strikes midnight, and somewhere beneath the moonlight a secret stirs. Dear listeners, welcome to the channel The Wimsey Casebook. This is Morgan Finch speaking. Always curious, where are you joining us from? Settle in. This is Murder by Moonlight at Merton Hall by Dorothy L. Sayers. It was not the scream that startled the occupants of Merton Hall. It was the silence that followed. At precisely 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, under a slice of waning moonlight in a sky swept clear by a March gale, the east wing of the house fell preternaturally still. No wind brushed against the leaded windows. No clocks ticked audibly. Even the fire in the library seemed to suspend its crackling in mid-breath. The effect was, as Lord Peter Wimsey later remarked, less like the calm before the storm, and more like the moment in a bad melodrama when the ghost considers whether or not to make a second entrance. Miss Sylvia Merton, great-niece to the late baronet and sole seasonal resident of the ancestral home, had only just returned from a rather underwhelming charity auction in Stowbridge. She had gone to bed in a flurry of taffeta and brandy vapours, complaining mildly of chilblains and heavier complaints of her cousins. It was her lady's maid who found her 2 hours later, sitting bolt upright in bed, her mouth slightly open, her gaze fixed on something just to the left of the doorway, as though it had passed through and left the door curiously ajar. Miss Merton's breathing was shallow, her right hand clutched at the bedspread. She said nothing. The housekeeper, a staunch and sensible woman of Northumberland stock, insisted Miss Merton had seen nothing more than a draught, or perhaps the trick of the firelight. "You know how the old East Wing is," she had muttered. "Always feeling watched when there's wind down the chimney, bad bricks, and Miss Sylvia drinks port with the weight of a widow twice her age." It might have ended there, dismissed as nocturnal fancy or late-night nerves, but for the presence of the body. The Reverend Horace Pardoe had been staying at Merton Hall for a week, ostensibly to catalogue some Jacobean psalters bequeathed to the chapel in the 16th century. A mild man with sallow cheeks and perpetually ink-stained fingers, Pardoe had been seen last in the library at just past midnight. He had made a note in his journal, Psalm 38, variant marginalia, and taken a single biscuit from the silver tray. No one heard him leave the room. No one saw him again, alive. He was discovered at dawn in the lower cloisters, face down in the lily pool, which had been drained since January and was now little more than a circular pit of moss, sediment, and broken statuary. His neck was twisted at an unnatural angle. His spectacles were still perched upon the bridge of his nose. Most disturbingly, his cassock appeared to have been turned inside out, the collar tucked beneath in a manner so deliberate that the local constable stared at it for a full minute before summoning the inspector from Ledbury. "I don't care for this business," said Inspector Merriman, a square-shouldered man with a voice like gravel in a teacup. "Not at all. Priests don't go turning themselves inside out at 4 in the morning. Wimsey arrived later that afternoon, entirely by accident. He had been motoring through Worcestershire with the vague notion of visiting a man who bred rare clocks, when a dismal weather change and a punctured tire sent him seeking hospitality in any form it might come. A postman at a dripping turnpike had pointed him toward Merton Hall. "Good place for a spare, sir, and they keep a proper kettle." Wimsey, amused, had obliged. He was shown into the morning room with the air of one who had been accidentally elected to office. "Ah," he said, inspecting the drawn curtains and the sombre cluster of household staff. "We're in mourning. For tea, or for the late Empire?" Sylvia Merton, her usual defiance subdued to something closer to disbelief, introduced herself with the stiffness of a woman clinging to etiquette, like a railing in a storm. "There's been an accident," she murmured. "A guest, Reverend Pardo. He was found—" "In the lily pool," Wimsey finished, removing his gloves. "And not the ornamental one in front of the conservatory, I hope. That one's far too shallow to do a decent job." "Excuse me." "Oh, nothing, just a passing thought." Wimsey smiled. "Merton Hall, is it? Delightful architectural confusion. One can never be quite sure which century one's in. Are the east wing's chimneys still drawing improperly?" This odd remark was met with blank stares. "The east wing," he repeated lightly. "I stayed here once as a boy. Spent an entire August losing chess matches to my uncle and having nightmares about the carved griffins on the library lintels. They haven't grown any friendlier, I suppose." Sylvia blinked, clearly uncertain whether the stranger had taken leave of his senses or if she had merely misplaced hers. It was at this precise moment that Lord Peter's valet, Bunter, arrived at the doorway and coughed with the precision of a man bringing formality into a room that had lost all context. "If I may, my lord," he said, "the constable informs me the inspector is presently conducting inquiries in the south corridor, but would appreciate your acquaintance once you are settled." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "News travels quickly. Have I been accused already?" "Merely expected, my lord." "Ah." He turned back to Sylvia Merton with the smile of one who had long ago made peace with being underestimated. "Well, Miss Merton, it seems your reverend's drowning. Has made ripples even in puddles. If you'll permit me to intrude for just a few hours, and a cup of whatever qualifies as tea in these parts, I might see if your tragedy has a tidy edge." He left the room with the nonchalance of a man inspecting the fabric of a waistcoat, but his eyes, alert beneath their languid lids, had already made an inventory. The rain-warped floorboards, the scuff marks at the edge of the hearth, the coal bucket turned slightly askew, the ancient grandfather clock, whose pendulum now hung dead. In the silence that returned after his departure, Sylvia Merton slowly looked up to find her maid still watching the door. "I don't like him," the girl whispered. "He smiles too easily." Sylvia, who had not yet decided whether she liked anyone that morning, said nothing. But somewhere in the hollow architecture of Merton Hall, a door that had been thought sealed for decades gave a faint, audible creak. And Lord Peter Wimsey, who had been halfway up the servants' staircase, stopped to listen, not to the sound itself, but to its precise placement in the morning's unfolding logic. He did not smile this time. Inspector Merriman was not a man to enjoy being outmanoeuvred in his own county. He was even less inclined to relish the company of aristocratic amateurs with an eye for furniture polish and dead vicars. Nevertheless, the presence of Lord Peter Wimsey had been sanctioned, tolerated, might be more apt, by someone in London, and the inspector, after 15 years of navigating awkward telegrams and stammering MPs, had developed a reluctant instinct for political weather. Still, his greeting was clipped. "You've come to take the waters, my lord." Wimsey, arms folded across a woolen overcoat, considered the portrait of an alarmingly jowled ancestor in the front hallway. "If by waters you mean muddy footprints and ecclesiastical homicide, then yes, though I dare say the lily pool's gone rather out of fashion since the Tudors." Merriman sighed, scratched his notebook, and gestured toward the rear of the house. "We'll begin with the servants. You're welcome to observe, but no tricks, Wimsey. This isn't a London salon. Here it's Worcestershire, and I like my inquiries conducted without riddles." "I assure you, Inspector," said Wimsey, following with a faint smile, "I only riddle after dinner. They found the housekeeper, Mrs. Dallimore, in the small pantry just off the main kitchen, her keys jangling against her apron, as she stirred a pot of something that bore an unfortunate resemblance to gruel. Her countenance, though firm, betrayed a sliver of unease, as if she had been expecting an altogether more straightforward kind of Thursday morning. "I knew something was off the moment I opened the scullery door," she announced, without prompting, as if addressing an invisible jury. "The whole place smelt wrong, not blood, you understand. Something sweeter. I thought at first it was lavender polish, but it weren't polish." Merriman scribbled. "What time did you rise?" 5:30. "I like the stoves warm, before anyone pokes their head out. I'd just come down when young Arthur, he's the boot boy, ran in shouting something about a shadow in the garden. Naturally, I told him to hush. The boy sees ghosts in his own laundry. But then I noticed the cloister door was open." "And the door is usually locked?" "Bolted from the inside. Always has been. No call to go out that way this time. Cavier. The pond's drained and the chapel's not had a proper service since Advent." Wimsey, meanwhile, had taken an interest in the kitchen tiles. He knelt, running a gloved finger along a worn crack by the scullery entrance. "Would you say the staff typically use this back passage to reach the servants' wing?" Mrs. Dallimore blinked at him. "Well, yes, but only during proper hours. At night the door's kept shut." "And the boot boy, he sleeps?" "Above the laundry near the old nursery. Up 2 flights. Wimsey stood brushing invisible dust from his trousers. Then for him to have seen something in the garden, he'd have to be leaning out over the narrow gable window at precisely the right angle. "I didn't say he saw it from his window. He said he was—" She paused, clearing her throat, "following a sound. A sort of piping." Merriman raised an eyebrow. "What sort of piping?" Mrs. Dallimore hesitated, clearly aware she stood at the delicate intersection of duty and superstition. Said it sounded like a child's flute, or maybe a recorder. Only wrong somehow, flat and slow. Gave me a turn, if I'm honest. Wimsey and Merriman exchanged glances. "Any children in the house?" asked the inspector. "No, sir. Haven't been since Miss Sylvia's cousins came up from Cornwall 2 summers ago. Not a toy left neither. Everything packed away." They thanked Mrs. Dallimore and moved on to the parlour-maid, a pale girl with an unfortunate tendency to twist her apron while answering. Her name, according to the list Bunter had already copied in precise pencil strokes, was Kitty March. "I was asleep, sir," she said to Merriman, eyes flitting nervously between him and Wimsey. "Didn't hear a thing. Only found out when Mrs. Dallimore knocked me up." "And you occupy which room?" "North attic, second door on the left. Overlooks the lane." Wimsey interjected gently. "Did you happen to notice if Miss Merton's fire was lit last night?" Kitty looked confused. "Yes, sir. Always is, this time of year. I laid it myself." "Was it burning steadily?" "When you checked this morning?" She blinked again. "No, sir, it had gone out, just a bit of ash." Wimsey nodded, and the girl, still unsure whether she'd erred, bobbed a curtsy and fled down the hallway. The butler, Mr. Trigg, proved less yielding. A man built like an upright wardrobe and twice as dignified, he had no time for mystery. "I laid out the port for the Reverend at 9 o'clock, he said, "and locked the cellarette as per standard. Saw him once more at 10:30, going into the library with that notebook of his. After that I retired." "You keep a key to the library?" Merriman asked. "Yes, sir, though it was not used. The door stood open this morning." Wimsey stepped into the conversation with the lightest of touches. "Tell me, Mr. Trigg, was Reverend Pardoe in the habit of pacing while he read?" The butler seemed startled by the question. "Why, yes, now that you mention it, I believe he did. Said it helped him think." "And did anyone complain of the noise?" "Only Miss Merton once. Said she thought rats were in the wall." Said Wimsey. "How musical the human mind becomes when searching for explanation." They proceeded to inspect the Reverend's quarters. Modest, paper-scented, filled with ecclesiastical marginalia and 3 different editions of the Pilgrim's Progress. Wimsey ran a finger along the edge of the desk drawer and frowned at a faint smudge of what appeared to be beeswax. Merriman noticed. Something. Merely that this particular drawer was opened rather recently by someone who doesn't handle wood polish. Possibly by someone looking for something they didn't find. And what do you suppose they were looking for? That, Inspector, said Wimsey, rising, is precisely what I intend to deduce, though I must say it's rare to find such industrious burglars in the clergy. Or such clumsy ones. As they stepped back into the hallway, Bunter approached with the calmness of a man announcing afternoon tea. My lord, the gardener's son, one Edward Malling, has returned from the village. He claims to have witnessed something unusual by the rear chapel wall at approximately 1:30 this morning. Oh? Said Wimsey, perking up. Do tell. He says, my lord, that he saw a figure in a cassock kneeling, mind you, on the broken font, and then apparently vanishing behind the hedge. Merriman gave a low grunt of disapproval. Superstitious twaddle. But Wimsey's face had changed. It was not alarmed nor amused, simply alert. Kneeling on the font, he repeated softly, and the Reverend found drowned, cassock reversed. Curious, most curious. Come, Inspector, let us find this young Mr. Malling and ask him whether the moon was out at the time. Why the moon? Asked Merriman, exasperated. Because, said Wimsey with a glint in his eye, we may yet find our timeline not in minutes but in shadows, and the moon does not lie. Young Edward Malling stood in the kitchen courtyard, scuffing his boot against a mossy stone, and clutching his cap as though it were an instrument of moral balance. He had the gangly bearing of a boy not yet finished by time, and a complexion more freckle than flesh. His left sleeve was damp, his hair matted by a mixture of fog and nerves. Even before he spoke, he looked guilty, not of crime, but of knowing. Too much for someone his age. Tell us exactly what you saw, said Inspector Merriman, adopting the tone he usually reserved for stray witnesses and unruly livestock. The boy glanced quickly at Wimsey, then back at the gravel. It were about 1:30, sir. I was coming back from the village. Mrs. Dallimore said I could nip down after evening chores, fetch a bit of tallow for the lanterns. Stayed a mite. Too long, maybe. Mr. Frayne at the Bull was pouring his stories like he pours his cider. You were drinking? Not me, sir. Just listening. Honest. He blinked rapidly, as if the truth might be hiding in his eyelashes. All right. Then, Merriman said gruffly, on your way back? I took the old chapel path quicker than circling round by the drive. That's when I heard it. A sound like someone humming, real low-like, gave me gooseflesh. Wimsey leaned forward slightly. A hymn tune? Couldn't say, just slow and sort of draggy. I got near the back of the chapel, and that's when I saw it. Someone kneeling on the broken font. Looked like a priest, long black robe and all, but the face was turned down, like he were praying or crying, or both. Did he see you? I don't think so. I stood behind the yew hedge, but then he sort of moved real quick-like and was gone. Slipped behind the wall. I waited a bit, then legged it round to the back door. Wimsey tapped his cane lightly against his boot. The moon, was it out? Bright as anything, sir, like glass. Merriman snorted. And you expect us to believe a man was sobbing over a broken font at 1:30 in the morning? I don't know, sir. Just saying what I saw. Wimsey smiled gently. And you did well. A broken font is a curious altar for grief. Thank you, Edward. That will be all. The boy nodded, grateful, and darted away through the herb garden. Merriman rolled his eyes. Next you'll be asking me to interrogate the gargoyles. Only if they've filed a change of address notice, murmured Wimsey. But young Malling is not inventing things, Inspector. Frightened boys don't usually furnish ecclesiastical symbolism. He turned, absently tracing the edge of a windowsill. And you say Miss Merton had a falling out with the Reverend 2 days ago? Merriman stiffened. We've not interviewed Miss Merton formally. No, but Mrs. Dallimore talks in paragraphs, and Kitty March babbles in subtext. Something about a letter, disapproval, religious disagreement. The inspector sighed. Miss Merton funds the chapel's restoration fund. Pardo, by all accounts, was pressing her to finance a new printing of his Salter research. She refused, politely but firmly. A temporal matter, then, tithes and typesetting. Wimsey shrugged. Hardly motive for murder. Maybe not. But her cousin, Mr. Simon Kersey, returned from London the same night. Apparently he and the Reverend had a bit of a row some weeks ago, something to do with the war memorial. Wimsey's eyes lit. A quarrel over marble? Delicious. Tell me more. They disagreed about the inscription. Pardo wanted to include a line from the Psalms, though I walk through the valley and so on. Kersey, being a modernist of the most strident sort, thought it mawkish. And so fists were raised over theology. Voices, more like. But it was heated. Kersey left in a huff, and now he's returned, night of the murder, no less. Arrived by the 10:08 from Paddington. Wimsey tapped his fingers along his jaw. Do we know precisely when the body was discovered? Not until morning. But the housekeeper says she passed the cloister door at 4, and it was closed then. And where is our apostate cousin now? Taking breakfast in the west parlour. Wimsey turned on his heel. Then let us interrupt his devotions with a few questions of our own. Simon Kersey did not rise when they entered. He was tall, indifferently dressed, and wore a moustache that would have looked rakish in 1910 and theatrical ever since. He greeted them with the vague courtesy of a man who had once been expelled from a Cambridge club and had never quite recovered. Inspector, and Lord Peter Wimsey, unless I'm much mistaken. He gestured vaguely toward a chair. To what do I owe this morning's interrogation? Merriman explained with the blunt precision of a farmer summarizing an infestation. When he finished, Kersey laughed, a dry, unmusical thing. So the poor old vicar's copped it, has he? In the lily pool, no less. Morbidly poetic. You arrived last night? Merriman asked. Yes. The 10:08 from Paddington. Got in around midnight. The driver dropped me at the outer gate. Walked the rest. Moonlight made it almost tolerable. Did you see anyone? Only a fox. Or possibly my aunt's ghost. Difficult to distinguish under such romantic lighting. Merriman's face darkened. And after entering the house, I poured myself a brandy from the decanter in the drawing-room, went up to bed, didn't fancy a midnight theological wrestling match with the Reverend. You were aware he was here? Of course. He sent me a note 2 weeks ago asking me to reconsider the inscription, quoting Isaiah this time, as though I'd be charmed by his liturgical jukebox. Wimsey interjected softly. Did you respond? No, I'd no wish to be drawn into another debate about textual nuance. If I wanted that, I'd visit the Bodleian and roll myself in parchment. Wimsey studied the man for a long moment. You strike me as someone who enjoys provocation. Kersey shrugged. So I've been told. Would you say the Reverend enjoyed being contradicted? Immensely. It gave him the moral high ground, which he occupied with the glee of a squatter in a foreclosed cathedral. Said Wimsey. One last thing. Did you happen to notice whether the library fire had been disturbed last night? Kersey blinked. I believe it was smouldering when I passed. Why? Wimsey smiled thinly. Because fires tend to tell tales, Mr. Kersey, especially when left untended. They left him there, swirling his brandy and staring into the middle, distance with the half-smirk of a man who enjoyed being half-suspected. Outside in the hall, Bunter was waiting with the composure of a man who had already anticipated the next 5 requests. My lord, he said, Miss Merton has asked whether you might join her for tea. She says she recalls you once quoted Don to a family portrait, and that she finds herself in need of poetic company." "Ah," murmured Wimsey. "The barometer drops. I shall attend immediately." He turned back toward Merriman. "Our suspect is articulate, arrogant, and conveniently placed, which means he's either a very clever murderer or a decoy with literary habits. Either way, we must tread carefully. And what do you plan to ask Miss Merton?" Wimsey gave a smile that could have been mistaken for amusement, had one not noticed the slight narrowing of the eyes behind it. "Nothing, Inspector. I shall simply listen. One learns more that way." The drawing-room at Merton Hall was as much an architectural essay as a place of repose. Oak-panelled walls, softened only slightly by damask drapery, gave the impression of a room determined to forget the 20th century altogether. A harpsichord sat in one corner beneath a heavy lace shawl, as though in mourning for an age that had abandoned ornament for functionality. The fire, despite its sullen attempt at warmth, cast elongated shadows across the parquet floor, each flicker revealing and then concealing the ancestral stiffness of the furniture. Miss Sylvia Merton sat with her back to the window, the pale afternoon light tracing faint silver through the strands of her hair. She wore a cashmere shawl that might have once been blue, and her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that Wimsey briefly wondered if she meant to crush a confession between them. "I remember you quite well," she said as Bunter poured the tea. "You and Gerald, your brother, spent a summer here when I was 16. You were frightfully thin and terribly clever." "Still am," said Wimsey agreeably, "though the first is mostly due to Bunter's firm disapproval of puddings, and the second is largely illusion." Sylvia allowed a faint smile. "You're here for the Reverend. Of course, he seems to have misplaced his heartbeat in the most inconvenient of locations, a theological inconvenience, one might say." Her smile faded. "It's not amusing, Lord Peter." "No," he said more gently, "but it is curious." She stirred her tea without drinking. "Do you suspect one of us?" "I make it a point never to suspect anyone, until they've had the opportunity to betray themselves through carelessness or wit. You'd be surprised how often it happens." Sylvia looked down at her cup. "I didn't care for Horace Pardoe. I won't pretend otherwise. I rather thought as much. But I wouldn't harm him. I rather hoped as much." The wind rustled against the panes. Wimsey glanced about the room, his gaze falling on a pair of rosewood armchairs with mismatched cushions. "I notice," he said idly, "that this room has changed." "Since when?" "Since 1912. The tapestry used to hang over the hearth, not beside it, and that fireplace poker, new, I presume." She blinked. "It was replaced last winter. The old one was bent." "Bent?" "During a draught. It fell awkwardly. Mr. Trigg said it wasn't worth salvaging." Wimsey nodded faintly. "Was the Reverend here then?" "No, he only began his visits this past year." "Ah." Sylvia leaned forward, her composure faltering ever so slightly. "You think the poker is important?" "I think bent. Things are often more revealing than straight ones. The world, Miss Merton, is full of murderers who tidy too well, and murderers who do not tidy at all. The former are dangerous, the latter obvious." She opened her mouth to speak, then seemed to reconsider. "I wonder," she said instead, "whether Horace's death has anything to do with his past." Wimsey tilted his head. "Past? He was not always a clergyman." "Few are. Did he have a scandal?" "Not exactly, but he was in love once with a woman much younger than himself. She jilted him, I think. It rather broke him." "Do we know the name?" "I don't. But I recall overhearing him speak of her to my cousin Clara. She played the flute, he said once, and wore violets in her hair like someone out of a tragic novella." "Flute?" Wimsey straightened slightly. "Not violin?" "No, I'm quite sure." He took a long sip of his tea. "Miss Merton, Has anyone else in the household ever spoken of hearing flute music, especially late at night? She looked surprised. Yes, Arthur, the boot boy. He mentioned it to Kitty, said it was eerie. She told him to keep quiet and stop reading ghost stories. Very wise of her, said Wimsey. He rose and wandered idly to the window, peering out at the long sloping lawn that led toward the cloister and the drained lily pool. The clouds were beginning to congeal, low and leaden. A murder had occurred, and the house had absorbed it, not violently, but quietly, like water into a stone floor. Miss Merton, he said, have you noticed anything missing from the house, a trinket, a book, a key? Something minor, perhaps, but displaced. She frowned. Not that I can think of. No matter. If you should, let me know. As Bunter retrieved the teacups, Wimsey offered a final bow and withdrew to the corridor, where Merriman waited with the grim patience of a man ready to detain someone, anyone, if it meant a resolution before supper. Learn anything? The say. Inspector asked. A few things. Miss Merton is candid but not entirely forthcoming. She knows more about the Reverend's personal life than she admits, and someone somewhere has been playing a flute. A flute? Yes. Or something very like it. It may be relevant, or it may be the product of this house's exceedingly baroque sense of humor. Merriman grunted. We've located Pardo's journal. It's being examined, and the coroner's come back with the preliminary. Cause of death, fracture at the base of the skull. No sign of a struggle. No defensive wounds. The water in the pond didn't kill him. Wimsey raised an eyebrow. So the drowning was window dressing. Exactly. The fall might have done it, but there's no obvious impact point near the edge of the pool, which means he was struck elsewhere and placed there, perhaps theatrically. Merriman flipped through his notes. Also something odd. The cassock, it was reversed, inside out, deliberate. Wimsey grew still. Symbolic inversion or ritual humiliation. Any idea what it means? No, said Wimsey quietly, but it's not random. They were interrupted by a footman, this one pale and whispering, who announced that a letter had been found in the Reverend's personal effects. It was addressed simply to A. The handwriting was looped, feminine, and the envelope unsealed. Inside was a single page bearing one line. You said I would forget. I never did. No signature, no return address. Wimsey held it gently in his gloved fingers. Curious, he murmured. A ghost from the past, or a message meant to appear so. Could be a forgery, said Merriman. Could be. Wimsey stared into the middle distance. But somehow I don't think so. Bunter, emerging from the stairwell, cleared his throat. My lord, I have taken the liberty of cross-referencing the Reverend's annotations. There is one curious entry, Psalm 77, underlined and marked. In the night I remembered my song, I meditated, and my spirit asked. Wimsey nodded slowly. Then we shall meditate too, and perhaps our spirit shall ask more pointedly. He moved to the window once again. Somewhere outside, in the creeping mist of approaching twilight, something watched, perhaps not a person, but an idea waiting to become one. The next morning came cloaked in fog so thick it could have been ladled. Merton Hall's stone facades loomed in ghostly fragments, as if seen through layers of gauze, while the trees along the eastern slope faded to silhouettes and the chimneys vanished entirely into a pale soup of weather and waiting. It was, Lord Peter observed, a day for misremembering things, and indeed memory was the subject of the morning's business. Bunter had risen at 6, precisely as expected, and by 7 had secured the full train schedule from Paddington to Ledbury, telegraphed with military promptness and filed in a crisp folio. He now stood beside Wimsey in the front library, the original crime scene, where a coal fire had been relit more out of ceremonial necessity than warmth. According to the records, Bunter said, Mr. Kersey's train departed Paddington at 10 minutes past 8, arrived in Ledbury at 10:06. Carriage hired from Messrs. Biddlecombe and Sons with a receipt signed at 10:10. Journey to Merton Hall estimated at 50 minutes. Wimsey turned from the library hearth, where a thin trail of soot on the bricks had caught his attention, leaving him at the Hall's gates by 11, and he claims he arrived at midnight, just after, walked from the outer gates according to his statement. Would you like the topography map, my lord? Later, Bunter. For now, tell me this. What's your sense of the fire? Bunter knelt with the gravity of a man preparing to polish a delicate relic. He examined the hearth with keen attention, brushing soot lightly with a gloved thumb. The fire was not built up after midnight. Logs half burned, ash cool at the base. If the Reverend was here at, say, 1 in the morning, he did not stoke it. Nor, I believe, was anyone else present long enough to notice. Suggesting either that he left the room in a hurry, or never returned after midnight at all. Quite so, my lord. Wimsey strolled to the far wall, where a low bookcase stood beneath the window. The volumes were thickly dusted, save for one, an old anthology of Anglican sermons, which had clearly been removed recently. He flipped it open. Inside was a pressed violet, dry and brittle, tucked at the page marked Renunciation and Resurrection. Symbolism again, Wimsey murmured. Merriman entered, removing his hat with the cautious air of a man who had begun to suspect that logic might be getting the better of him. We've checked with Pardoe's vicarage, he said. No indication. He was being threatened. No debts. No known enemies. Then we must look to unknown ones, Wimsey replied. Also, Merriman continued, we've confirmed the handwriting on the letter found in his drawer. It doesn't match anyone in the house, but it does bear resemblance to a Miss Viola Faraday, a music instructor formerly employed at the Norwich Conservatory. Music? Wimsey's brow lifted. And does Miss Faraday by any chance play the flute? She does, in fact. Marvellous. And where is she now? In Geneva. Left England 2 years ago after a brief engagement, broken off under uncertain circumstances. Wimsey gave a long, low whistle. Let me hazard a guess. The Reverend Horace Pardoe. Merriman looked mildly surprised. Yes. Then the letter's no forgery. Pardoe kept it because it was the only thing he had left. Of what? Of her. Of a life unlived. Of a road not taken, one lined with violets and unfortunate woodwind instruments. Merriman shook his head. This is beginning to sound like a sentimental novel. Sentiment is not incompatible with murder, Inspector. In fact, it is often its midwife. They moved to the chapel soon after. The Reverend's journal had made repeated references to its acoustics, resonant but lacking warmth, he had noted, and Wimsey was eager to test this for himself. The place had the air of recent neglect, dust along the pew rails, hymnals gone askew, a lectern bearing the brass imprint of a hand no longer present. The broken font sat to the left of the altar, its rim cracked clean through like a split chalice. Wimsey examined it in silence. It's wide enough to kneel on, he said at last, but precarious. A poor platform for penance. Unless you wished to be seen. You think someone posed there deliberately? Merriman asked. It's possible. Consider the image. A solitary figure, moonlit, in religious garb, kneeling at a symbol of baptism fractured long ago. What does that say to you? Melodrama. To the unimaginative, but to a killer with a flair for the Gothic, it's theatre. Wimsey walked the perimeter, tracing his fingers along the stone walls. At one point he paused, then reached into a narrow gap between 2 stones. Ah, he said, producing a small object. Our housemaid's ghost. It was a child's, flute, cracked at the base, one reed missing, dusty but not ancient. Not quite Elizabethan, Wimsey said, turning it over. More likely Edwardian. Cheap, but capable, I'd wager, of producing a sound unpleasant enough to pass for otherworldly. In the right hands. Merriman took it gingerly. You think this was used to scare the staff? I think it was used to create confusion. A sound out of place, drifting through the halls at night. Disorientation, misdirection. It's the magician's toolkit. And perhaps the murderer's too. They returned to the main hall where the butler, Mr. Trigg, was waiting with a faint frown. "If I may, my lord," he said, "there is something I neglected to mention. I thought it trifling, but now, do go on." "Yesterday morning, when I retrieved the library key, I noticed the wall clock had stopped at precisely 1:28. It's not prone to error. It was fully wound." Wimsey's eyes gleamed. "Then we have an anchor. 1:28, somewhere between the Reverend's final movements and his death." "Could he have struck it during a fall?" Merriman asked. "Unlikely. The clock is on the mantel. Any fall sufficient to dislodge it would have shattered it. No, he adjusted it, or someone did, and then forgot to restart it." Bunter appeared then, bearing another note. "From the village, my lord. A reply to your earlier inquiry." Wimsey scanned it quickly. "Ah, delightful. Miss Faraday is alive, well, and teaching chamber music in Lausanne. She confirms that the Reverend wrote to her just last week, asking forgiveness for the past and quoting, curiously, Psalm 77. He looked up. He was trying to make peace. He was remembering his song in the night. And someone didn't want him to, Merriman said grimly. Or someone feared what else he might remember. Outside, the fog had lifted fractionally, revealing a garden half dead with winter. Wimsey stared at the path that led from the library to the cloister and beyond, following it with his eyes, as if reading an invisible sentence scrawled across the lawn. "Inspector," he said slowly, "it's time we reconstruct his final hour, not where he was seen, but where he was not. Because somewhere in this house, something happened between 1 o'clock and 1:28, and it left a man dead, a cassock reversed, and a melody unfinished." It was a curious thing, thought Wimsey, how the truth had a habit of peering sideways through the fabric of seemingly ordinary lives, not bursting through the door in a great melodramatic gasp, but slipping in through the hinges. One rarely encountered a double life in the fashion of pulp fiction, no wigs, secret bank vaults, or names scrawled in blood. More often, it was the quiet bifurcation of one's duties and desires. And Reverend Horace Pardoe, as it happened, had left just enough trace for Lord Peter to begin unpicking the seam. "I should like to see the Reverend's luggage," Wimsey said late that afternoon, as he and Bunter re-entered the guest wing of Merton Hall. "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, already producing a key which had, quite mysteriously, found its way into his possession earlier that morning. Pardoe's room was a modest affair, facing east toward the chapel and the rolling fields. A crucifix hung above the writing desk, and his coat hung neatly on a peg. There was no sign of disarray, save for a single sock poking from the half-open drawer of the tall boy. Odd, because Pardoe was known for his fastidiousness. Wimsey opened the valise on the bed. It contained precisely what one would expect of a rural clergyman: starched collars, a shaving kit, a black-bound copy of the Book of Common Prayer, and a small pocket Bible with marginalia so tight and crabbed it might have been the trackings of a spider on a pilgrimage, but underneath the clerical garb was something more surprising. "Ah," said Wimsey, drawing out a worn leather portfolio and flipping it open. Inside were 20 or so pages of manuscript, typed single-spaced, and bearing the working title Faith, Fiction, and the Forgotten, an essay on the emotional lives of the devout. "How curious," he murmured. Bunter, peering discreetly, noted, "It seems to be written under a pseudonym, my lord. H.C. Pennyworth." "Pennyworth," Wimsey echoed, "a rather sentimental name for a man whose profession prides itself on moral accounting, but then, even reverends dream." He leafed through the pages, eyes scanning quickly. The prose was introspective, even lyrical in places, reflections on regret, oblique references to the woman whose music haunted even silence. A confession, almost, but not to a crime, rather to a life misshapen by restraint. "So," said Wimsey aloud, "he lived as Reverend Pardoe but wrote as Mr. Pennyworth. Not quite two men, but certainly one whose shadow stretched differently in private. Should we inform the inspector?" "In time, Bunter. For now, let's regard this as a personal indulgence. Unless, of course, the indulgence became known to someone who found it distasteful." He returned the papers to the case and turned to examine the desk. The ink bottle had dried at the rim. A letter lay half-written, though the addressee's name was never completed. The words on the page were odd. "I cannot leave this place without telling someone. The font is a scar. I see it nightly." Wimsey read it twice, then closed the blotter over it. He had something to say, but either he never said it, or he said it in a form no one recognized. From the wardrobe, Bunter produced a second satchel, brown canvas, less formal, clearly not in general use. Inside were receipts, mostly unremarkable, a train stub from Norwich, a note from the Walsingham Press about a typesetting delay, and tucked in the bottom a small envelope containing a photograph. It was sepia, creased and delicately smudged. A young woman seated on a garden bench, laughing toward someone just out of frame. Her dress was light-coloured. A small flute rested in her lap. "She's quite beautiful," said Bunter. "Yes," murmured Wimsey, "and alive still, in Lausanne." He replaced the photo, slowly. "Now then," he said after a moment, "let us take a walk." They stepped out into the evening, the fog having receded into a reluctant dampness. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. As they crossed the gravel drive, they met Kitty March returning from the stables, her apron hem slightly muddied. "Ah, Miss March," said Wimsey, doffing his hat. "Might I trouble you for a small question?" Kitty, startled, nodded. "Yes. Sir, do you recall the last time you entered the Reverend's room?" 2 days ago, sir, before supper. I emptied the wastebasket and turned down the bed." "Did you notice anything out of place?" She bit her lip. "Only, well, the second satchel wasn't there before, not that I remember." "And you said you heard nothing that night?" "No, sir, except—" She hesitated. "Well, it's silly, but I thought I heard someone whistling, not loud, just a few notes, like a nursery tune. It stopped when I opened my window." Wimsey nodded. "And did anyone else hear it?" "Arthur said he did, but then he said it might have been the wind." "Thank you, Miss March, that will be all." As she disappeared into the house, Wimsey turned to Bunter. "We are building something, Bunter. Not yet a solution, but certainly a shape. A man divided by profession and passion. A house with a history too quiet for comfort. A tune that plays only in moonlight. And the family, my lord." "Ah, yes, the family." They returned to the morning-room, where Simon Kersey was holding forth to no one in particular about the perils of amateur theology. When Wimsey entered, he glanced up with the sardonic grin of someone accustomed to confrontation. "Lord Peter," he drawled, "do tell me you found a ghost in the font." "Not yet," Wimsey said amiably. "But I found something. Almost as dangerous, an unpublished essay." "Pardoe's?" "Indeed, written under a pen name, quite stirring in parts. Did you know he wrote—" Simon hesitated. Just a flicker. "No, not really." He kept to himself. I find that people who keep to themselves often have quite a lot to say when they believe no one is listening. Simon poured himself a brandy. You suspect me of something again, don't you? Not at all, said Wimsey, accepting a glass himself. Though I find it interesting you knew nothing of his past, and yet were so opposed to his theology. I opposed his sanctimony. Ah, that's a more flexible target. Sylvia Merton entered then, carrying a slim leather book. I found this in the old piano bench, she said, holding it out. It belonged to my aunt. She was a friend of Miss Faraday's once. They used to perform duets at fêtes in the village. Wimsey opened the book. It was a collection of folk songs and hymns. Several were marked in red pencil. One page had a faint watermark in the shape of a violet. Music again, he murmured. Everywhere the echo of music, and always it leads back to the font. What are you thinking? Asked Sylvia. That the Reverend Pardoe did not return to Merton Hall only to catalogue psalters, said Wimsey softly. He came here to atone, or perhaps to confront something left unresolved, and someone, in turn, feared what that confrontation might reveal. He paused. And now that someone is counting on us not to see what lies beneath the surface. He turned suddenly decisive. Bunter, ready the lanterns. Inspector Merriman should meet us at the cloister door. Tonight I want to walk every inch of that route from the library to the lily pool. I want to time the footfalls. I want to test the echoes. I want to see with my own eyes what cannot be seen in daylight. Bunter inclined his head. Very good, my lord. As the house settled once more into its creaking stillness, Lord Peter Wimsey stared into the darkening hall, where oil paintings watched and clocks refused to chime, and imagined a man retracing his regrets, step by solemn step, to a font broken by time and belief. They set out just past 8, the air raw with mist and moonlight, threading the hedges in pewter. The grounds of Merton Hall were still, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Wimsey, lantern in hand, led the small procession along the gravel path that skirted the eastern edge of the manor, and curved, in a series of soft descents, toward the cloister and the lily pool where the Reverend Horace Pardoe had been found. Inspector Merriman trudged beside him, notebook at the ready, his breath steaming in short bursts. Behind them, Bunter moved with the fluid assurance of a man conducting a ritual rather than an investigation. We begin, said Wimsey quietly, at the library, the Reverend's last known location. They stood just beneath the bay window that jutted out from the eastern side of the house. From within, the warm glow of firelight barely filtered through the heavy curtains. Wimsey struck a pose, deliberate, reflective. The Reverend exits here, he said, sometime after midnight, perhaps to walk, perhaps to think, but why? Restless, suggested Merriman. He was agitated. Possibly, or summoned. He took a few slow paces along the stone path, then stopped. Listen. They stood in silence. From somewhere in the orchard a nightjar trilled, then nothing. You see, said Wimsey, this path is narrow, flanked by shrubs. You'd not take it unless familiar with the terrain. Merriman gave a grunt. Locals know it. Indeed. But the Reverend was only recently acquainted with this route, and yet he went this way. They continued on, reaching the chapel in just under 5 minutes. The broken font loomed to their left, pale in the moonlight. Wimsey circled it slowly. I timed this earlier, he said. From the library to the font, 4 minutes, 37 seconds. Add hesitation, perhaps 5. He gestured toward the pool. And from here to the lily basin, another 2 minutes at most. The question is not how he got here. It's why he paused. Merriman folded his arms. You think someone waited for him here? Perhaps. Or perhaps he came to meet someone, or to confess. He knelt by the font, running his fingers along its cold rim. "Look here, the edge, see the scoring." Merriman crouched beside him. A faint groove, barely noticeable in the moonlight, curved along the upper lip of the stone. "Scraped," said Wimsey. "A hard object, dragged." He reached into his coat and removed the child's flute recovered earlier. Carefully, he laid it against the groove. "Look at the alignment. The mouthpiece fits perfectly." "You think it was placed here?" "I think it rested here, briefly. A signal, perhaps, or a ritual gesture. Poirot may have found it." Wimsey stood, brushing dust from his trousers. A flute in the dark, a font cracked by time, and a priest with too much memory in his heart. They moved toward the lily pool, Bunter lighting their way. The basin was still, save for the murky reflection of the moon. Wimsey gazed down. He was placed here after death, cassock reversed, a gesture meant to shock. But I wonder, was it meant for the household, or for someone in particular? He turned abruptly. "Let's go back to the drawing room." They retraced their steps in silence. Inside, the drawing room was dim and firelit. Miss Sylvia Merton sat by the hearth with a book open but unread, on her lap. She looked up as they entered. "More revelations?" she asked. "More questions," said Wimsey. "Tell me, did your aunt ever speak of the font?" Sylvia blinked. "My aunt? The elder Miss Merton, the one who knew—" "Miss Faraday," Sylvia considered. "She said it was cursed, cracked during a lightning storm in the 1890s. There was talk of rebuilding it. The funds were misappropriated." "To where?" "To the village school, my grandfather insisted. There was a row, a clergyman resigned." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "A resignation. Was the Reverend Poirot involved?" No, that would have been years before his time." "Still, he may have known." Sylvia hesitated. "He did once mention the font was a site of failure. I thought he meant the restoration effort." Wimsey turned toward the fire. "Failure," he repeated, "or guilt." He examined the mantelpiece, where a set of small porcelain, miniatures Anglican saints rendered in pale glazed ceramic, stood in a neat line. One figure was slightly displaced. "Has someone dusted recently?" Sylvia shook her head. "Not since yesterday." Wimsey adjusted the figurine. It wobbled ever so slightly. "The vibration of footsteps, or a tremor, or, more likely, someone." Brushed it in passing. He stooped and examined the floor beneath. "There, do you see it?" Merriman joined him. A faint scratch, half obscured by the rug. "Moved furniture?" he asked. "Perhaps, or something heavy was dragged. A chair, or—" He stood. "Bunter. The poker, if you please." Bunter retrieved the new iron poker from its stand. "Now imagine it used, not for fire tending, but as a bludgeon. The weight, the length, it would match the Reverend's injuries." "Then why no blood?" Merriman asked. "Because he was struck elsewhere, perhaps in this very room, then moved. The rug hides all." Sylvia had grown pale. "You believe he died here?" "I believe he confronted someone here. Someone he trusted or pitied, and they struck him in haste or desperation." "But why move him?" "To stage the death, to send a message." He turned to her suddenly. "Miss Merton, who else knew about Miss Faraday's visit to your aunt?" Sylvia blinked. Only Simon, I suppose. He catalogued the old music. He read her letters. Then he knew of Poirot's past." She nodded slowly. Wimsey moved to the window. Outside, the mist had thickened again. A flute, a font, a reversed cassock, all fragments. But one detail remains. He approached the writing desk and opened the bottom drawer. A broken letter opener, he said softly, retrieving a jagged piece of ivory. Filed to a point. Why here? Sylvia gasped. That belonged to my aunt. She used it to open sealed scores. It was missing yesterday. He turned it over. There's residue here, dried wax, black. Bunter took it, examined it under his lens. From a seal, my lord. Possibly a music envelope. Broken deliberately. Then we may presume the killer opened a letter never meant for them. Wimsey looked toward the hearth. And now we must ask, who in this house feared what the Reverend might do with knowledge long buried? And who would risk murder to keep it from returning? The great hall of Merton was not built for comfort. Its vaulted ceiling, once intended to impress rather than embrace, echoed footsteps with exaggerated gravity, while the high mullioned windows, long since thickened with centuries of leaden glass, admitted light as though doing penance for the privilege. At 10:15 that evening, the candelabras were lit, Bunter's discreet handiwork, and the fire in the great hearth had been coaxed into reluctant brilliance. The guests had been summoned, the staff quietly instructed to listen but not interrupt. Lord Peter Wimsey stood beneath the ancestral oil portraits, with his back to the fire, the light flaring off his monocle and giving him the faint look of a conjurer preparing to reveal the final card. There was a strange quiet to the room, not tense but anticipatory, as though everyone present had grown used to half-truths and was faintly terrified by the prospect of a whole one. Inspector Merriman leaned against the stone pillar to Wimsey's right, arms folded and expression wary. Sylvia Merton sat in a high-backed chair, hands gripping the carved arms with pale knuckles. Simon Kersey paced slowly near the billiards table, not so much nervous as visibly irritated by the delay. The rest, Trigg, Kitty March, Arthur the bootboy, Mrs. Dallimore, and Edward Malling, clustered in the background, respectful yet watchful. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Wimsey lightly, "you will forgive, I hope, a certain taste for the dramatic. I assure you it's not vanity, merely efficiency. It saves the necessity of endless repetition if all relevant parties hear the truth at once." He strolled forward a few paces. The death of the Reverend Horace Pardoe was not, as some have mused, the result of accident, madness, or divine retribution. It was murder, calculated, intimate, and intended to communicate. A murmur rose in the back. Merriman gave a warning glance. Wimsey continued. Now our victim was a man of routine, a scholar, a clergyman, and, if his private writings are to be believed, a man with deep regrets, specifically a regret named Viola Faraday. Sylvia stirred faintly. "Yes, Miss Faraday," Wimsey went on, "whose photograph was found tucked among his effects, whose letters were once read by a member of this household, and whose flute, cheap, cracked but unmistakable, was discovered tucked behind the altar font." He turned his gaze toward Simon Kersey, who met it coolly. "You read those letters, did you not, Mr. Kersey?" Simon shrugged. "I sorted the family music collection last autumn. If there were letters, they must have been with the scores." "Indeed, and one in particular made reference to a time when Pardoe courted Miss Faraday, a time when, according to a now-destroyed correspondence, she claimed to be pregnant." Gasps rose at this. Sylvia covered her mouth with her hand. Trigg's lips thinned. Wimsey raised a calming hand. "We have no evidence she bore a child. In fact, Miss Faraday herself denies it. But the possibility alone, combined with guilt and fading opportunity, was enough to lure the Reverend back to Merton Hall. Not for Salters, for peace. He sought reconciliation. Merriman stepped forward, and someone feared that reconciliation. "Precisely." Wimsey turned toward the fire. "Now then, What does one do when facing exposure? One tries to silence the source, but quietly, oh yes. Reverend Pardo was not struck down in the chapel nor near the font. He was attacked in the drawing room. Another gasp. Simon paled slightly. Right. Here, Wimsey continued, gesturing. Sometime between 1 and 1:28, the Reverend confronted someone, perhaps accusing, perhaps begging silence. We know this by the figurine disturbed, the scratch in the floor, the half-written note in his room. He stepped toward the hearth and took up the iron poker. Struck from behind, no time for a struggle. The poker was likely cleaned and replaced or discarded. The new one is too recent to be the weapon. Bunter is confirming this. And then what? Asked Merriman. Then, said Wimsey, turning back to the room, the killer reversed the cassock, symbolic humiliation. Deliberate, not improvised. The body was dragged along the cloister path, yes, dragged, and placed in the lily pool. Not for concealment, but performance. He turned now to Arthur, the boot boy. You saw something in the garden, Arthur. Her shape, possibly the killer returning, but your description suggests a smaller frame than the Reverend. Arthur blinked. Yes, sir. Which narrows our field. Wimsey now turned fully to Simon Kersey. You staged the scene, Mr. Kersey. You hoped to imply madness, some ghostly ritual, but you underestimated one detail. Simon stiffened. Wimsey walked to the writing desk. From the drawer he took the broken ivory letter opener. You used this, he said quietly, to open a sealed envelope addressed to the Reverend. A final letter from Miss Faraday marked with wax. But in breaking it you left residue, wax fibers embedded in the grain. It matches precisely with the documents Bunter retrieved this afternoon. Merriman took a sharp step forward. You're saying? I'm saying, said Wimsey, his voice low and certain, that Simon Kersey knew of the Reverend's past, feared its consequences, feared, perhaps, that an inheritance or reputation might be jeopardized, and when the Reverend returned in earnest humility, Kersey acted. Sylvia stood suddenly. No, it can't be. It is, said Wimsey gently. The final clue, Miss Merton, came from your own hand. The music book you found bore a watermark, a violet. The same symbol referenced in Pardo's journal and the Faraday letters. A detail so personal, so specific, that only someone obsessed with the past could have recreated it in performance. Simon Kersey did not move. He stared at the poker, then at Wimsey. She ruined him, he said at last. Viola took his mind, his purpose, and he came crawling back for absolution. He'd have dragged us all into scandal. Old family secrets, your aunt knew it. She paid Faraday to vanish. I saw the letters. I knew what he meant to do. Wimsey nodded slowly. You thought him weak, you made it theatrical. But murder, he added, is never quite so tidy. Merriman stepped forward. Simon Kersey, I must ask you to— No need, said Simon, raising both hands. I've no interest in escaping. Not any more. As he was escorted from the room, the silence left behind was nearly oppressive. Wimsey at last returned to the hearth and studied the flames. The Reverend sought forgiveness, he said softly, and instead met judgment. It is perhaps the oldest story in the book. Sylvia stood frozen, her eyes glistening. Will this stain everything? She whispered. Wimsey looked up. No. Truth never stains, Miss Merton, it reveals. He stepped past her toward the door, Bunter following. And behind them, the old house of Merton stood a little straighter, as though a weight long borne in silence had at last been named aloud. 3 days later, the skies over Merton Hall shed the last of their winter reluctance and gave in to an overcast stillness that seemed less weather and more mood. The great house stood quiet again, not in its former hush of ancestral suppression, but with the softened breath of something released. The snowdrops had begun to gather timidly near the roots of the yews, and the cloister path bore fresh prints, neither panicked nor furtive, but measured, thoughtful. Lord Peter Wimsey took his tea alone that morning in the oriel of the east-facing drawing-room, the morning edition of the Times folded on the arm of his chair. Bunter, having seen to the packing, had left him to a final hour of reflection. There was no fire, only the kind of gentle warmth that comes from a long, cold stone finally yielding to the sun. He stirred his tea slowly, listening, not to footsteps or voices, but to the texture of the quiet. It was no longer the oppressive silence that had followed Pardo's death, nor the brittle tension that had hung between confession and arrest. This was something else. Not peace exactly, but the beginning of it. Sylvia Merton entered with a touch more ease than she'd displayed in the days previous. Her eyes were clear, if a little shadowed by lack of sleep, and her shawl was of a lighter wool. She stood by the window for a moment before speaking. "I'm told you're leaving," she said. "Yes," Wimsey replied. "Before the house begins to suspect me of loitering, or worse, renovation." She smiled faintly, then turned toward him, hands clasped lightly in front of her. "You were right, you know," she said. "He did come back for forgiveness." Wimsey nodded, and was met instead by someone who mistook contrition for threat. Sylvia lowered herself into the chair opposite him. "I keep wondering whether I could have stopped it," she said. "If I had pressed Simon about the past, if I had listened more closely. One cannot rewrite the past by revisiting it," Wimsey said gently, "only by allowing its truths to stand, and learning where we ourselves turn away." They sat for a moment, the ticking of the long case clock in the hallway sounding louder than usual. "I've decided to donate the font," she said suddenly, "to the chapel in Stowbridge. The stone can be salvaged, reshaped, maybe even blessed again." "A fitting gesture," said Wimsey, "if a tad optimistic. But the dead do appreciate a sense of continuity, I'm told." She gave a soft laugh. "And the music scores. I'm thinking of sending them to Miss Faraday. She should have them. Her letters, too." Wimsey gave her a look of quiet approval. "Closure, Miss Merton, is not always found in arrests and verdicts. Sometimes it's just the act of returning a story to its rightful narrator." Sylvia stood again, arms folded as she looked toward the window. "What will happen to Simon?" "He'll face the law," Wimsey said, "but with some sympathy, I imagine. The act was tragic, yes, but not the work of a cold mind. He was a man cornered by memory and by fear." She turned back. "You almost sound sorry for him." "I'm sorry for everyone in this house," Wimsey said. No one emerged untouched, Pardo most of all. He came in the hope of reconciliation and met instead the residue of old pain and younger pride. He rose, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "Well," he said lightly, "Bunter will be growing anxious. He gets jumpy when we linger too long in places with unfashionable clocks." Sylvia approached and offered her hand. "You've given me more than answers, Lord Peter. You've given this house a kind of breath again." He took her hand and bowed his head slightly. "If so, Miss Merton, then perhaps this time it will exhale honestly." As he stepped into the hallway, Bunter appeared with coat and gloves in hand. "The motor is ready, my lord." "Excellent." They descended the stone steps into the waiting morning. The air was crisp, but not unfriendly. The last of the frost was receding into the edges of the lawn. As they approached the car, Arthur the bootboy darted from the stable-yard. "Sir, Lord Wimsey." Wimsey turned, amused. "Yes, Arthur." The boy glanced down, a little embarrassed. Will, you be writing about this in a book, maybe? Wimsey chuckled. Not I, Arthur. I leave that to cleverer men with more patience, but if ever you hear someone humming a tune they shouldn't, don't ignore it. Yes, sir. He gave a quick salute, then ran off again, leaving Wimsey, smiling faintly. The drive out of Merton Hall was slow, deliberately so. Wimsey gazed out the window as the house receded behind them, its many chimneys and battlements now softened by distance and drizzle. He spoke quietly, mostly to himself. "It is always music," he said. "Notes played once and never fully, resolved. The human soul composed in a minor key." Bunter, from the driver's seat, said nothing. He understood his master's tone, and that there was nothing more to be said, only to be remembered. As they joined the main road and the mist lifted further, Merton Hall disappeared entirely behind a gentle rise in the landscape. It had offered its secrets reluctantly and at cost, but the cost had been paid, and the truth, however flawed, however late, had found its voice. A fortnight later, Lord Peter Wimsey sat once more at his writing desk in the Piccadilly flat, surrounded by books in varying stages of indifference, a half-played chess game with himself, and the comforting clink of Bunter preparing sherry in the adjoining room. Outside, London moved at its customary blur, omnibuses, bells, and the distant warble of a fruit vendor in unseasonal optimism. But within the chambers of 110A, a distinct stillness had settled. Wimsey leaned back, tapping, a slender forefinger, against a typewritten letter that had arrived by the afternoon post. The paper was thick, the ink faintly lavender. The crest at the top, a coiled fern encircling a lyre, was unfamiliar. The signature, however, was not. Viola Faraday. Her words were brief and formally measured, but not cold. She had received the music scores from Miss Sylvia Merton, with what she called a mixture of sadness and unexpected gratitude. There was no mention of Horace Pardoe by name, but a paragraph near the end bore the unmistakable watermark of closure. "I once thought memory was something to be preserved against the world, but perhaps it is also a thing to be released, like breath held too long in the lungs. Thank you for restoring something I thought long buried." Wimsey folded the letter, slipping it into the leather-bound file that now bore the name Merton Hall Case Notes. He rose and crossed to the hearth, where the fire, still early in its construction, flickered shyly against the iron grate. A kettle hissed in the other room. Somewhere below, the flat's resident pianist, a retired Hungarian of mysterious origin and erratic tempo, attempted Chopin with renewed vigor. "Your sherry, my lord," said Bunter, entering with the tray. "Ah, Bunter. The only tonic with a sense of timing." Bunter set the glass down on the low table, then stepped back with his usual restraint. "Have you heard from Miss Merton?" "Yes," said Wimsey, swirling the sherry absently. "Twice, in fact. The first was merely to confirm that the old font had been removed, carefully, reverently, and was on its way to Stowbridge. The second was shorter. She's taken in as a young orphan from the parish school. The boy shows promise as a chorister. She says she doesn't know what prompted her, except that the silence in the house had grown too symmetrical." "Very good, my lord." Wimsey sipped, then turned to the window, watching the faint steam from his breath vanish against the glass. "It's curious, Bunter," he said, "how murder rarely ends in the courtroom. Oh, the verdict is rendered, the punishment issued, but the echo, it lingers, in a house, in a piece of music, in a woman remembering violets." "Yes, my lord. I suppose that's what we do, really, chase echoes, try to catch them before they distort completely." He paused. "And sometimes one finds a melody." Bunter said nothing, but his silence, as always, was the appropriate reply. Wimsey wandered to the bookshelf and extracted a slim volume, The Consolations of Philosophy, its edges weathered and softened by time. He flipped it open to a marked page. No man is free who is not a master of himself. Pardo, he thought, had failed to master the past, but had tried at least to be reconciled with it. In that effort lay something nobler than all the polished sermons in his battered manuscript. And Kersey, for all his scorn, had feared not scandal, but the crumbling of a life built on half-truths. Neither man had emerged unscathed. One lay beneath a marker in the Merton chapel, the other awaited the verdict of a quieter judge. And still the story had not been one of triumph, not in the ordinary sense. Wimsey turned toward the chessboard. Black's queen had been placed, deliberately, perhaps idly, next to a pawn that should have never gotten that far down the file. He reset the board, arranging the pieces with the precision of someone who found comfort in symbolic order. Then he sat, let the silence settle, and closed his eyes. In the faint distance, the Hungarian pianist reached the final notes of a nocturne. Slightly off-tempo but sincere, it was enough.